going to take a deep dive into norepinephrine and dopamine. Okay, norepinephrine is synthesized from dopamine. Norepinephrine neurons originate in the locus coeruleus, right here in the mid to upper brainstem. The locus coeruleus is activated by stress or a new stimulus. The neurons exit the locus coeruleus and some descend down the spinal cord, but the remainder ascend up through the upper brainstem, first passing through the dorsal raphe, which is the origin of serotonin neurons. And this is how we can see that norepinephrine actually governs the serotonin system. Then some of the neurons branch off and enter the cerebellum, and others branch off up to the cingulate gyrus, wrapping around the limbic system down to the amygdala and hippocampus. And this is where norepinephrine triggers access to memory. They then project on down peripherally to the adrenal glands, whereby they trigger the peripheral sympathetic nervous system. The adrenals trigger peripheral cortisol and epinephrine production, getting us ready for fight or flight. So the amygdala and hippocampus, responsible for memory. This is what norepinephrine is doing in the brain. It's helping us with memory. It's helping us with attention, arousal, alertness. And it's doing this in the limbic system by binding to alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. Okay, norepinephrine. Let's just take a minute to think about how time is perceived in the limbic system. In the limbic system, norepinephrine helps us consider the past. The limbic system is about survival right now based on experience. But we cannot, in our limbic system, consider long-term consequences of any of our actions other than survival of ourselves and the species. Okay, now let's look at what norepinephrine is doing outside of the limbic system and into the cortex. Actually, the most important projections of norepinephrine neurons are in the cortex. And here they will bind to alpha receptors 1A, 1D, and 2A, where they will serve as an amplifier, non-specifically amplifying all incoming signals. Norepinephrine in the cortex is how we pay attention. However, if dopamine isn't also present, we cannot distinguish what input is important, nor consider the future. Okay, norepinephrine, a review. It's synthesized from dopamine in the limbic system, whose job is survival right now based on emotions and memory. Norepinephrine binds to alpha 2B and 2C, where we experience emotions, regulate serotonin, regulate alertness and arousal, regulate and direct attention, access working memory, assign emotional labels to experiences and store them as memories, trigger fight, flight, freeze, or reproduce. And in the cortex, where the jobs are planning, reasoning, problem solving, recognizing and managing behavioral projection of emotions, social skills, processing sensory information, sense of time, language, reading, speech, and integrating the functions of all the lobes. Norepinephrine binds to alpha 1A, 1D, and 2A to regulate sensory input detection, amplify sensory signals, consider future consequences of actions, and attend to important information, but only if dopamine is also there. Now let's talk about dopamine. Dopamine is synthesized from tyrosine. Dopamine neurons originate in the substantia nigra compacta and the ventral tegmental area. Some neurons extend down to the locus coeruleus, which is where, as you recall, norepinephrine neurons emerge, but the majority travel up and out to the cortex. Dopamine receptors are highly concentrated in the prefrontal cortex and the primary motor cortex, as well as the temporal and parietal lobes. But there are almost no dopamine receptors in the somatosensory cortex or occipital region. In the prefrontal cortex, dopamine seems to help us make decisions about whether something is as good, better, or worse than our expectations. And this is called reward prediction. So, dopamine is the go signal from the prefrontal cortex that tells the body to do something that may involve reward. And it does that by binding to the dopamine receptor D1, dopamine receptor D4, and dopamine receptor D5. And it serves as a buffer to the amplification of input coming from norepinephrine, which quiets the noise and helps prioritize the most important stimuli. So, dopamine review. It's synthesized from tyrosine. It's in the brainstem. It helps us synthesize norepinephrine. In the cortex, whose jobs are planning, reasoning, problem solving, recognizing and managing behavioral projection of emotions, social skills, processing sensory information, sense of time, language, reading, speech, and integrating all of the functions, dopamine binds to D1, D2, and D5 to regulate the processing and prioritization of information, regulates motivation by predicting whether a stimulus will provide a reward, and provides the motor signal to go perform the action that will provide the reward. All right, let's talk about functional connectivity networks for a moment. Specifically, let's talk about the dual process theory. And this is way dumbed down and oversimplified because I'm not a neuroscientist, and also for the context of this presentation. But advanced imaging techniques have demonstrated that the presence of neurological functional networks, areas that fire together, wire together, and that these light up when we are engaged in certain states of functioning. And in the dual process theory, there are two cognitive processing modes. You have the default mode network, or system one. And this is, when it's just intuition. We're just associative thinking. It's self-reflective. It's based on experience. We're just chilling in the environment, thinking about ourselves, thinking about emotions. It's fast, it's quick, it's effortless. There's no effort happening here. But it's where emotions and thought or cognitions come together and integrate. And then on the opposite side of this, we have the task functional network, or system two. And this is where deliberation is happening. It's rules-based thinking. It's use of cognitive resources, and it's based on symbolic and abstract rule manipulation. It's slower thinking. It requires effort. How do they interact with each other? The network activity when not engaged in a task. The default mode network upregulates. And the task functional network downregulates. Network activity when you're engaged in a task. The default mode network downregulates. Task functional network upregulates, right? Right. Okay. All right. Now that we've had a review of normal neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, let's talk about what's happening in ADHD. So the ADHD pathophysiology and genetics, as we understand it so far. There are specific neurological structures that are affected by ADHD, and they include the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, parietal and temporal lobes, and the cerebellum. So pretty much everything except the occipital lobe, or the visual cortex. All right, how about the genetics? Heritability is very high. 80% concordance rate in twin studies. That's huge. If a parent has it, a child has a greater than 50% risk. If a sibling has it, there's a greater than 30% risk. The molecular genetics that have been identified so far, there are 12 significant risk areas that have been identified and located on 11 of the 23 chromosomes. And the suspected genes involved are the dopamine receptor D4, dopamine receptor D5, and dopamine transport T1, and that's the reuptake receptor. And what we believe is that epigenetics likely plays a large role here. And the most convincing ones so far are that you may have a genetic susceptibility to have the genotype, but then perhaps there is exposure to cigarette smoke in utero or alcohol, and it turns on the gene for the phenotype to develop. Other factors that can increase risk of someone having ADHD is low birth weight, some kind of toxin exposure, lead, things like that. Strep infections, things such as pandas can evolve into ADHD, and also traumatic brain injury.